Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we probe the gender landscape within contemporary culture.
And we consider the implications of prioritizing personal identity over other aspects of the self.
This is the thinking person's take on gender.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens. Howdy, Stella. How are you this afternoon?
I'm good. Good to be back chatting with you.
Yes, definitely. What's going on in the world of Stella these days? Obviously, for our YouTube viewers, you're somewhere different today.
I am. I'm in a hotel in London, and it's always great. I like going away once in a while. I like going home always, but it gives me a perspective of my life. Once I get away, I kind of get a snapshot of where I'm going at home. It's very good for me mentally. So I'm away working, giving a talk and stuff. But it's a big, I think a lot of things are happening, as always, in gender world. Not so much in gender world. My book will be released soon.
That's so exciting.
Yeah, what your teen is trying to tell you. So I'm very excited by it. I put my heart and soul into this book. It's been a hard book to write because there's so much to say about teenagers, and the idea is to kind of help parents not like immediately turn to therapists, even though therapy can be very helpful, but to see if you can empower yourself by leaning in, learning a few things. There might be it's like being on a railroad track and you're a little bit off and you get further and further, and if you can tweak it back with a couple of little things, it can make a difference.
Yeah.
And so but we'll talk about that again in the future, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I just think it's great because that's so aligned with a message we're often sharing on this podcast and through our individual work, that we want to put the kind of power back in the hands of parents so that they can, nobody's going to love your kid as much as you do. So if you can feel a little more confident parenting them, that makes a huge world of a difference, I think.
And I think parents, we got disempowered. I, as a parent, know that's what compelled me to write my first book. We got totally disempowered. And it has continued on until teenage years that we presume other people know what to do with our young, distressed kid more than we do. It's extraordinary, the push. As soon as your kid is upset, people say, are you going to get help? And it's like, maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe the kid needs more of you. You're a flawed person, because we're all flawed. You know what I mean? It's a kind of a frightening thing. And on that subject, when you give your power away, Detrans Awareness Day is coming up, big day, the 12th of March, and it's a self-organised day. The detransitioners, I think they first organised it in 2021, and it's a hashtag all day. There's a website, detransawareness.org, so that they're kind of they're self-organising, which is great. It's great to see the detransitioners self-organising. And there's going to be loads of events, and, Genspect is supporting as much as they can all the Detrans Awareness Day events. It's really important to support them, I think, and make sure that people realise that, something has happened to these people and they need to be recognised. Genspect did a brilliant webinar last year, 2022, Detrans Awareness Day, and we got loads of people on, and they were amazing. And it was really difficult. I don't know, I had a power cut in the middle of it, and it was chaotic, but it was really, really good.
Wait, a power cut? What do you mean? Oh, your power went out. I do remember that.
I was like, that Bohemian Rhapsody video? I was a little pale head.
It was dramatic for sure. I do remember that.
Sinead Watson was very good because she seamlessly took over, and she was very good. Very, very good. But so I think the detransitioners are rising, they're self-organising, they're coming together, and I think that's really amazing.
And I mean, if somebody has never really heard of what that means before, I mean, most people who listen to our show are familiar with this concept, but we may be getting some new listeners. And for those who aren't aware, detransitioners are individuals who, for some time identified as transgender and took some kind of medical steps in that transition process, whether that's cross-sex hormones or in some cases surgeries. And then for a variety of very complicated reasons, many detransitioners have come to believe that that was a real mistake, or that they feel they were harmed by the quick way that the medical system kind of pushed them through towards transition. And their stories are really interesting and harrowing, and they're an example of what happens when a mental health and medical establishment kind of works from an assumption backwards. Like, the assumption is transition is really, really helpful for those who want it, and there could never be a possible reason why somebody would want this, but actually it's not going to benefit them. And so when providers are really affirming, that sounds great on the surface because you're giving the patient what they want, you're helping them meet their own goals. But there's a lack of kind of caution and assessment and slowing down. And a lot of detransition stories really exemplify that. Just kind of the quick pace by which all the professionals they met just pushed them along. Yes, 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 I agree with you. Yes, let's get you these hormones. And of course, the ramifications, both socially, medically, physically, for their health are huge. And it's a very complicated process trying to make sense of that experience. And so this Detrans Awareness Day is a chance for individuals who have been through this kind of thing to talk about their experiences and bring more awareness to the subject, because it's growing and we see people coming to this realization and having this experience in pretty large numbers, considering how typically, activists and advocates say detransition is incredibly rare. It's like 1% of people, but actually that's not true at all. And as transition procedures have become more readily available in the last 10, 15 years, so have the detransition numbers. So that's what Detransition Awareness Day is. And if you're kind of new to this whole gender world, we would really encourage you to just take part, go watch some of these individuals tell their stories so that you can understand kind of the human perspective behind this very heated and controversial topic.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the definition, because the way that trans has become this blurred, nebulous term that nobody really knows what it is.
Yeah,
we all of us nerds who are very absorbed in gender noticed that the standards of care in WPATH, they obfuscated the meaning of detransition and made it less clear cut. Well, we had established detransition was just like you outlined, it was a very specific process. And it's like it's been reclaimed to be part of the gender journey and part of, almost open to people move in and move out of detransition and all sorts of phrases. And then there's the phrase, there's different phrases coming in. And it's just something we need public awareness around what is an accepted term for trans, which is, I would argue, medical transition. What is an accepted term for detrans? It's, reverting back after medical transition, and maybe desistance is, reverting back to your biological identity, never having taken medication in the first place. So that people are clear, because it's very hard to feel knowledgeable and have an opinion on something when you're not quite sure what you're talking about.
Yeah, completely. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to bring us seamlessly into today's subject, you could argue that, the Detrans Awareness Day, the kind of the rush to medicalize identities, the pathologizing of normal distress into quick fixes and give us the medication, always looking for the external solution for an internal problem. You could argue that is really where we land with this kind of the pathologizing of normal and the kind of the lure of identities that has swept over people since we've taken away other identities such as religion and national identity. Other identities have come into place, and it's extraordinary, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, and I was thinking about this topic, just like how diagnostic labels have become a source of identity as well. So it's interesting because this, of course, relates to gender. It relates so much to the stories of quick transition and subsequent detransition. It, of course, relates to people who choose to kind of continue on with transition and have a gender identity. But it also relates to so many other things too, like as a culture, at least, Western culture, we went from a place where mental health issues were never talked about. They were really dismissed, and they were treated as something you sweep under the rug, and you don't talk about these things, to a place now where it's so ubiquitous to talk about mental health, and it's luckily been depathologized, but in a way, there's a way that it has become like a positive sense of identity for people, like a way that people make meaning of who they are as a person, which probably has some trade-offs in it as well. It's like you either stigmatize the mental health condition or you turn it into a source of pride and identity. And I can imagine that in both of those scenarios, there are negative consequences, right? So it's an interesting pendulum swing that I think has happened.
Well, and that's what it is. It's a pendulum swing. And you know that phrase, too far east is west. Like we've swung too far. Like, having it taboo didn't work. And then having it as an identity doesn't work either. And that is the problem. I think for me, it people are searching for an identity, and we're shaped by what's going on in the zeitgeist, in the cultural context, and it feels like mental health is going on in the cultural context. That's what's going on.
Yeah.
But it feels like quite a shallow understanding. I remember one client telling me, we have a big kind of walk every year. It's a great walk. It's for suicide, and it's in Ireland. It's a great walk that everybody does. The whole of the kind of country kind of gets together, and they walk from darkness into the light. So they walk into the darkness into the dawn. It's a lovely idea. But I remember at this girl who I knew, and she said, they were all being so awful to her around her mental health, and then she said, but they're all out there swinging their banners, darkness into light, and we know this concept very well in other contexts. There's a lip service given to mental health. Think positive. This is my identity. This is my mental health kind of diagnosis, and it doesn't feel very deep. And it feels like we're doing everybody an injustice. I don't think it's working. Even though I think it's fundamentally unhealthy to base your identity upon your mental health diagnosis. I also think it's not a very good understanding of mental health diagnosis that we're kind of putting out there. It doesn't feel like it's good.
When you think about that, though, are there specific examples that are coming to your mind? Like what's on your mind when you say we're simplifying it or it's watered down?
Okay,
what do you mean?
Good point. I think when people say, oh, my OCD brain, oh, my autistic brain, and they don't mean their OCD brain, they're talking about their neat and tidy, or their autistic brain because they're like being organised. It has become such a concept creep that everything is a mental health. So it's anxiety rather than I'm worried. It's OCD rather than I like things tidy. It's do you know what I mean? And
yes.
it's really, really detrimental to our mental health. It's really detrimental that we've normalised this, that everything is pathological. And children are growing up in this world so that they don't have a little worry, they have anxiety. And then I suppose some people who've been diagnosed feel very annoyed about that, but also you think the diagnoses aren't infallible, and the vibe from people is you'd swear it was an actual blood test the way people go on about it. I have an actual diagnosis, and it's like, well, the diagnosis depends on the practitioner, frankly.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So you're talking about the way colloquially people use oh, I'm so OCD, which I'm sure I've done this before too, even though I'm a mental health professional. But yeah, you're talking about the colloquial uses of these terms. And then on the other side of that, how even if you have a legitimate diagnosis from a psychiatrist, that doesn't actually tell us that much.
It's not God talking. And doctors are as fallible as everybody else, and psychiatrists are as fallible, and the diagnosis isn't necessarily gold-plated. And I have been shocked since I've been working as a psychotherapist, the deference and respect that is given to a diagnosis. It unnerves me. I'm like, whoa, because that wouldn't be how, when you know what the criteria is for the diagnosis, you'd feel a lot less deferential about it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like people want to have a legitimized way to say, like, look, I'm in pain. I have the paperwork to prove it.
Yeah.
You know, like there's something about it there that feels really palpable. And I'm thinking too about like conversations I've had in general in therapy. And I think like, you know, for people who do feel, and this is so hard to talk about because everybody feels different, but like if you genuinely recognize that like everybody else seems to be swimming along, making do in this particular school system or this particular peer group, and for me every single step in the road feels like a huge speed bump that I don't know how to get over. I think like sometimes having a sense of like community with other people who are similar in their quirks, like it can feel comforting. And I think people can feel like I can let my guard down. You know, I don't have to explain like why I do these odd things because everybody here does these odd things. Like I can understand for sure how that is a sense of relief. But I think, you know, when I think about the problems associated with this trend of like pathologizing normal, I think there's a way that getting overly identified with labels can really hinder us. And it can kind of, you know, become a self-fulfilling prophecy if you start reading, micro-scrutinizing all of your behavior through the lens of your label. It can prevent you from having expansive options and having flexibility, which everybody needs to have in order to function.
Yeah, and I don't know what we're going to do about this as a society because, you know, you and I 20 years ago would have been saying, we've got to get this destigmatized, we've got to get it out there. We would have been saying the exact opposite in many ways. And I feel like it's a balance to be trite, but it is a balance. And why it's really unfortunate that people are feeling that, because when I was only talking to somebody yesterday and they said a turning point in my life was when I got when I got a diagnosis for autism. It was a turning point. It made me slot everything into place. I understood all those experiences. I kind of got myself for the first time. It was like absolutely pivotal to my understanding of myself. I've heard loads of people say different things around that, variations of that. It can be such a source of relief, such a source of, that's what's going on. Now I get it. So it definitely has a place. The problem is it slid into being a criteria, just like as all roads lead to gender, but just like gender, it can be anything. It feels like it can be anything. It feels like these kind of, we have widened our understanding of all of these diagnoses into, or all these conditions into almost anybody, not almost anybody, but there's an awful lot of people can be diagnosed with an awful lot of conditions. And that is unfortunate.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking about like, what would the naysayers say? You know, and a naysayer might say, well, I mean, maybe you guys operate in a world of people who come to therapists. So by definition, you're being exposed to a population who either has a mental health diagnosis or is more likely to identify with a mental health diagnosis. But you know, even, you know, somebody like Alan Francis, I don't know if you've heard of him. He was like the chair of the DSM for many years, something like that. And he now is actually writes about and speaks about diagnostic inflation and the warning that actually we're overdiagnosing people. And in an interview, he said something like, never believe the extremely high rates of mental disorders routinely reported by epidemiological studies in psychiatry. Usually they label about 25% of the general population as mentally ill in the past year and 50% over a lifetime. So, I mean, 50% of people having a mental illness over a lifetime, that almost makes you question, well, is it even an illness if everyone has it? You know, like there is something to that number that you do have to question. What does that even mean anymore?
Might it be rejecting the fact that life is hard? And I think life is actually very hard. And therefore, if you're deeply distressed, mental illness needs to be brought into the equation for a reason for why you're deeply distressed, rather than you've just got a whack from life, which can be so deeply unfair and so sad and so difficult. And that if I was to renew the public campaign,
Yes.
that would be where I'd go, which sounds very grim. Life is hard. Put it on posters. But do you know what I mean? That I think it's actually much more realistic and much more informative. And when people realised, actually, I remember it was a realisation for me that other people get as distressed as me. And I thought, oh, I didn't think they did. They wear it differently. So they wear it, like some people wear their distress and you wouldn't know they were distressed. And now, obviously, as I work as a psychotherapist, I know how distressed people get. Yeah. And you wouldn't know. And you know that quote, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And I know that was from over 100 years ago and stuff. But I think there is something in it. There is an awful lot of pain. And people just keep going. They find their own way. They knock their own little happiness out of life, be it with something small or something bigger. And other people tend to think everybody else is finding life easier. And children in particular in this world are thinking, if I'm unhappy, something is wrong. As opposed to, there's a dawning between, and I write about this in my book, what your teen is trying to tell you, but there's a dawning realization between the ages of about 10 and 20 of, oh my God, life is really hard. Oh, the good guy doesn't always win. Oh my God, it's so unfair. It's really hard. Yeah. That needs to be taken right out of mental health and into, that is life.
No, that's why I think it's like so valuable to have a place for these like philosophical and existential questions about life, and to kind of, these are essentially spiritual questions, but I don't think it has to be framed in that context. Like, these are questions of living. Like, I remember reading somewhere, there's somebody in psychiatry said all mental health disorders are either like a biological problem or a problem of living, or something along those lines. I can't remember the exact quote, but you're so right. This kind of awakening that happens to us in our adolescent years can send a lot of people into a very dark place. Yeah. And if we have kind of, the only tool is the hammer, which is the diagnostic labels, everything is going to look like a nail. But actually the suffering and the pain of being an adolescent is really profound. And
the realization, that your friends are lovely and they're not always perfect and they're going to be flawed. And that realization is so shocking, especially kids who've been told all these movies and gorgeous literature and gorgeous books about great friendships. And then they realize they're not that great. That's shocking.
Yeah, it's a real betrayal of your sense of like that everything is going to work out perfectly all the time. Yeah. And that's hard to realize.
And I do think it's no accident that this diagnosis kind of era has come in after religion has gone out. So in a lot of ways in the Western world, when a lot of people would have kind of gone to religion between 10 and 20, because it's like life is hard and there was a system. The idea was, you're going to be confronted with challenges, and in the ever after, you will be rewarded. The kingdom of heaven will be your reward. And that was a great framework for your average 10, 15-year-old to know. Okay, so it's really hard. Okay, if you do A, B, and C, you'll get into heaven. There's a point to it. If you do D, E, and F, you'll go to hell. Okay, right, they're the rules. This is the point. This is where I'm going. And it caused its own trouble, and I'm not religious, and I'm not saying that's what we need to bring back. I don't think that. But I do think we took that away, and then we left them with mental health. It's like the new religion in many ways. It's the kind of, so you have to get your diagnosis, get to the therapist, learn the strategies, and then
get the pills.
Then you'll be okay. And that's just, that is the arc of the detransitioner, kind of going, okay, I'll do what I'm told, I'll do the framework, I'll follow the treatment path, and then what's going to be at the end? I'll be happy. And no, whether it's OCD or whether it's gender dysphoria, no, that's not at the end of the path.
Yeah. It's the kind of, it's also the ability to say, like, this is overwhelming to me. I don't quite understand to do. There's going to be an authority figure that I can trust, that we have put a lot of faith in, whether it's God, a priest, the therapist, the doctor.
Yeah.
And they will give me answers. They will give me my step-by-step process to take. And if I follow that process, it will be okay. And I mean, to be fair, there are a lot of conditions, especially medical conditions, where that works out very, very well. And I think, you talk a lot about the medical model of mental disorder. And I think this is where it becomes really slippery, because if we treat emotional and psychic distress as a kind of medical condition, then it makes perfect sense to put that faith in the step-by-step medical process. But actually, that cannot possibly reflect all the things that are contributing or maybe inevitable about some suffering in life. I mean, that's the medical model, and that's where we have a problem. And
the medical,
it's like, there's always examples where it works, but not for everyone.
Yeah. That's the problem. And that's why we've got a tricky subject here, because it does work. Definitely. People will be annoyed listening to us because they'll be thinking, it worked for me. The best thing I ever got was that diagnosis. And the years I didn't have it were really, really excruciating. And you're right, listener. Yeah. You are right. And then there's a whole other section of people who have clung on to a diagnosis, and it has externalized their problem. They've given away their power. They think it's out there. And they presume that the doctor, which frankly might as well be the priest, is going to, reward them with the happiness. And we'd be better off learning that happiness, it's not really a condition that many of us have for a long time. It comes and it goes,
Okay, so this raises an interesting question that maybe we can toss around. What are the characteristics or ways that a person can interact with a diagnosis in a healthy way? Like, when somebody gets a diagnosis, what's the difference between a person who takes that and uses it in a way that supports their life and expands their opportunities versus somebody who gets the diagnosis and it spirals them into a place that is maladaptive? Like, what do you think? I don't have an answer for this, but like the way you framed that really actually made me think, okay, there's a difference, because some people's diagnoses help them a lot, and for some people it doesn't.
I remember, what comes to mind is, I remember a friend of mine, her kid got a diagnosis, and the mental health practitioner said, okay, this is the diagnosis, this is the framework. You as the parent, you need to read it, you need to learn it, you need to understand it, and then you need to put it in a drawer. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. She said, like, put it in a drawer. Don't bring it everywhere with you. You know what I mean? You get the kind of the concept, and it's almost like this is how you work. And it's taken me many years to figure out how I work. And now I've kind of come to terms with how I work. Oh no, I can't do this. I know everybody else likes breakfast. It takes me an hour or two before I can get ready for breakfast. I've made my peace with it. How I work emotionally.
So do you have like breakfast deficiency disorder or something? Like, is that your diagnosis?
I could probably very easily get diagnosed with that. Yeah, no, like, honestly,
it's not a real diagnosis, by the way, everyone.
But there's so many quirks to me, to you, to all of us. Do you follow me? And like, here I am, I'm 48 and I've come around to all my multitude of quirks, and that's how I work, and that's how I work. And if I don't get enough sleep, and if I don't get, blah, 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 the humans are complex. And so
totally
getting a quick framework, if I'd got one, if there was such a thing as a framework that matched, because we don't know what diagnoses are to come, because maybe I am a diagnosis that is still yet being conceptualized in a lab somewhere. Do you know what I mean? But maybe it would be very, very, very helpful. But also what would also be helpful at the same time as your diagnosis is knowing that your uncle was like you, and also your granddad was like you. And also actually there's a kind of a characteristic from your country of origin that is quite strong in you. And that there's also a cultural impact, because if you look societally and the people around you, that's also, and you're getting a nice, colourful, proper understanding of yourself. Well, if you're all about your diagnosis, you have missed your family context, you have missed your cultural context, you've missed the kind of the other influences, and you have missed half the picture. You really have.
Yeah. I love that. I'm thinking about like the concentric rings. Isn't there like a psychologist called like Brahmansfeld or something? Do you know who I'm talking about? And he had this image of these concentric rings. I'll have to look it up, but it's the context that shapes you as an individual, and there's multiple layers of context.
Yeah. And now we're all about the diagnosis and the framework and the mental health. And back in the day, like I've said a good few times, but it's worth repeating, as I always do, 100 years ago, you and I would have been completely shaped in our understanding of ourselves by our you would have been shaped by your ethnicity, I suppose Egyptian or something, and I would have been shaped by being Irish, and it would have been a major part, and also it would have been I'm a Catholic, and you know what I mean? These would have been very major parts of my understanding of myself. So we're just a moment in time right now. It's all about this, and it's missing so much. I really do think if you want to widen your kids' understanding of themselves, make sure you bring the family tree. Make sure you get a bit of understanding of your auntie is actually very like you, or something like that. You know what I mean? So that they understand there's more. Think that's great. There's more going on than just what your little square here. We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high quality content for the show.
To take an even deeper dive and support the show, join our listener community for access to exclusive content, practical tools, and resources supporting gender and identity exploration. We're so grateful to our sponsor, Genspect, an international organization which offers an alternative to WPATH, providing a range of education, resources, and supports to anyone impacted by gender distress. Genspect unites many different organizations globally and gives voice to thousands of previously untold stories. For more info, visit genspect.org.
And thank you to our sponsor, RIME. Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics is a non-profit organisation dedicated to improving long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
And now back to the conversation. And I also think, like, in addition to understanding the contributing factors to, like, how you are what you are, or how you work, as you put it, it also helps, in the context of if someone does have a diagnosis, to ask yourself, okay, and then what? I have this diagnosis. And when I work with kids we're talking about diagnoses, because I'm not really anti or for diagnosis. I just think it matters how we frame it. I really, sometimes I encourage kids to pursue a diagnosis, and sometimes I tell kids not to get too identified with it, depending on how they're interacting with the diagnosis. But, I often say, whether or not you have like a piece of paper, you obviously have recognized that you have this cluster of traits. So if you have these traits, what things are hard for you? What things are easy for you? And what can we do to help you, knowing yourself, to do the things you care about and to do the things in your world that you want to do? And like, what supports do you need? What boundaries do you need to set? Like, what limitations are there? And I think, not letting a diagnosis become a reason you can't. I mean, of course, there are times when, my cluster of traits means I can't do so-and-so things, like you with your breakfast, right? Or whatever. But I also think being able to own like some of our unique qualities, even if they're challenging, and still live, still participate, still kind of own it.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And I know that comes up sometimes in the context of like, some of the neurodivergence movements and some of these contemporary movements. I don't agree with all of them, but what I do agree with is that we can't require people to fit into a very, very narrow set of traits in order to live functional lives. We have to give everyone the space to figure out, like, knowing my quirks and knowing my traits, how do I live a meaningful life?
And I think if your child is very absorbed, or if you are very absorbed in your identity as your diagnosis, or you've over-identified, have become over-reliant, you could do worse than checking out, remember the Myers-Briggs tests? Do you remember the personality tests? They were very good. You could do worse than checking out some of those type of things. Filling in those extensive kind of, what are they called? Questionnaires. The Enneagram, the personality, They're really interesting. They'll give you all sorts back on yourself. You'll go, oh, that is me, and you will find the same sense of recognition and acknowledgement of who you are as you will have found with your diagnosis. And you'll go, oh, there's more to me. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That I think it's really important that we don't narrow ourselves into something, because it doesn't help when we kind of make ourselves a kind of a more one-dimensional than we are. We're very complex. And so you have to honour it by bringing in all the different parts of you. I think it could really help. I wanted, and myself and Alistair had big projects, and we still haven't done it, about bringing in a kind of a personality test that brought in gender and brought in the Myers-Briggs, and very ambitious.
I love that.
Yeah. Do you follow me? Like a 21st century kind of understanding of who you are, because personality has moved to identity.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yes.
And so now what was my personality is now my identity. And that just happened without any of us really noticing it. It happened culturally in the last 10 years ago. If I had said I identify as, if I had said that sentence 15 years ago, I think it would have sounded very clunky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it would have sounded really clumsy. Nobody would have really understood what you meant by that.
Yeah.
I did find it, the kind of system I was referencing is called Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. And it starts in the middle with the individual, and then there's a microsystem bigger than that, then a mesosystem and an exosystem and a macrosystem. So it's kind of a theory of child development. But I remember seeing that visual. I'm kind of visually oriented. So when I see a graphic like that, it really makes sense to me. We'll include something about it in the notes. But all of this talk makes me think, well, there's two things I'd love to think through with you. I guess one is, we've been cautioning so far about the possibility that we're overdiagnosing people, or that people have become overly dependent on what their diagnosis means as a kind of single pathway out of their distress, which we think is not necessarily going to get you what you want. But I also wonder, do you agree that there is a kind of mental health crisis amongst adolescents? And how does that kind of relate to this? Because I think there is, but I also think it's been almost self-perpetuated by the obsession with mental health. Like, it's like kind of iatrogenic in a way.
This is a massive question that I have agonized over, because I know how awful adolescence was for so many people in times gone by. I've read enough literature. I know how lonely it has been. It has been devastating. I know how awful. Yeah. There's been so much secret child abuse. There's been so much awful things happening. So you kind of think, on one level, like we've all got richer and like our homes have all got better, on one level we've made a massive step forward in our mental health. It really does feel like, just like we have in our health and our food and our, you know what I mean? But food is actually a very good analogy for this, because while we made a huge step forward in our food and our diet, we also made a huge step backwards in our diet at the very same time, if you follow me. So that we've got this vast array of food available to us, and at the same time we've the vast array of really unhealthy food available to us. And so we seem to have, you can sink into the bad stuff. And it feels like that. I kind of get into this. I know I'm talking about my book a lot and probably too much, but I get into this in one of the chapters.
No,
in the
go
book.
ahead.
Yeah, I do. I go really into this fact. Are they having a mental health crisis, or are we looking at it a hell of a lot more? Honestly, I'm with you, Sasha. I think it's incredibly hard to be a teenager at the moment. And I think you could pick different periods of time and you could say it was very hard to be a mother at that point. It was very hard to be a man at that point. Maybe they were all going to war or whatever. I think it's very hard to be a teenager at this point. I think social media in particular, technology, porn, all the pressures, all the likes and the pylons and all that, I do think, and this kind of extraordinary emphasis on mental health, which isn't massively helpful. I do think it's really, really, really hard. And I also think as a society, just to be annoyingly complicated, as a society, we've done something very good for mental health. We have. It's like food. We did something great and we brought in an awful lot of bad. Do you know what I mean? We did both. Am I as clear as mud here?
No. I think what you're saying is perfectly clear. I think the food analogy is interesting because I've started thinking about that and looking at it in a slightly different way, which I think is going to be the road we go towards with technology too. And I even remember kind of you talking about this, like, from my years of like obsession with and research in like the fitness world and the bodybuilding world, like I try not to label foods as good or bad. What the research shows, like unequivocally across like tons and tons of nutrition research, is like in moderate doses, any food can be part of a healthy diet that keeps your weight stable and keeps you generally functioning well, organs doing well, blood sugar doing well. And I think the same is probably also true with technology. Like social media is a technological invention that we have not had around very long. And whenever a new exciting, especially like dopamine stimulating technology comes into the picture, we all just get totally absorbed by it. And I remember you saying like there's probably going to be campaigns popping up, and I think we see this in our own world, where we're recognizing that social media has to be monitored in terms of when it's introduced, how much time is spent, and what type of social media interactions kids are having, because that can have a negative impact on their health. And I think the same is probably true for like questions of identity and how fixated you get on your label. Like it's probably a dose response issue, like so many things biologically, probably also psychologically. So, you know, and personality makes a difference too. Like you can have one kid come across some sort of, quiz online, like here, diagnose yourself and figure out if you're trans, and they might take it and get a result and laugh it off and never think about it again. But if you have that kind of personality trait where you get fixed and obsessed, that one cue can spiral you into a very dangerous place, and it could have been some other cue as well. So I think it's really interesting. We'll have to see what happens as we as a society on the macro scale recognize the impacts of these things, recognize what does it mean to be an adolescent with this technology in your hand. Like it's going to be different than being a 40-year-old, right, with this technology in your hand. So I imagine we're going to see a lot of changes. But like right now, if you're a parent of a kid or if you're a young person, and I mean, how many detransitioners do you see on Twitter? Like they're in true agony over social media comments, like real agony about it.
Yeah.
And I really feel for that. And it may be a personality thing or maybe an age thing, but like, I have never really been super distressed by what happens on social media. So it's so interesting and also sad to see how these kinds of platforms can really tremendously impact a person's well-being. Whereas for some of us, like, I don't even take it seriously. Like, I don't even take screens that seriously, if that makes sense. I don't know how to, but it kind of inoculates me from actually being very concerned, because what's happening with my family, the people who love me and the people I work with, like that's, for me, it feels more consequential. But if your world exists, in these digital spaces, I can imagine how hard it is. It's just really interesting.
Yeah. Well, we ourselves, our generation, we grew up without that kind of online smartphone. You know what I mean? So therefore, we've got a step removed. We were formed without it. They are formed
Yeah.
with it. And I do think that makes a difference. It's like their left arm, if you follow me. It's so much part of their identity. Me and my phone, if you follow me. It's frightening, actually. I really, now both my kids are teenagers. I'm horrified how all four of us, because I'm as bad as them and Henry's as bad as them, we're all just phone addicts. And I'm like, we're going to have to do some sort of detox because we're all doing it. And we were having a conversation. We had somebody for dinner last night and somebody asked something. We didn't know the answer. Immediately grabbed the phone.
I know.
Somebody asked something. The conversation went back. We were polite, so we put away our phones after we found this non-event of a question. And then, sorry, I'm ranting, but I have to say,
no, that's
and
right.
And then some joke came up, and they said, "Oh, did you see that online?" No, I didn't. Oh, wait, I'll just get it for you. Oh, no, don't get it for me. Some picture, and you just go, oh yeah, there's the picture. Oh yeah, right, funny.
Yes.
We're like, and you can see there's a movement. There's a new movement people have, which is to get their phone and then they go away.
Oh my God.
There really is.
Yes.
It's a kind of it's frightening.
Yes.
It's a jitter that people have, and it's kind of, one, to go for the phone, and two, a lot of us don't go for it. We pull away. We know that we're in polite society. We need to stop grabbing our phone like it's a drug. So I do think that there's going to be studies that will show this. I do think that these teenagers, they do seem frantic. And I do think there's a concept called professional deformation, where you and I, Sasha, we're seeing the worst of it. We are seeing the worst. We are deformed by our professional life, so we see the worst of it. But what we see is so frightening, and you don't meet any therapist who doesn't really agree with us. I think every therapist thinks there does feel like there's a mental health crisis among the young people. They feel like they're not enjoying their teenage years the way you would hope they would. I really don't think that they're getting through them as opposed to enjoying them. Sad.
You're so right about that movement. That's really interesting. Like like how you can't even complete a conversation or a thought without referencing something that happened digitally.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a whole other conversation, but I do want to ask you about this, which I feel like we should do a whole episode about this, and we can ask the audience if the following thing I'm about to say should be a whole episode. Please let us know. What about this whole movement of young people online on like TikTok and various platforms claiming to have dissociative identity disorders and multiple personalities? I mean, that is, to me, like the exemplar of what we're talking about, of like how a diagnosis can take on a life of its own and totally absorb young people, and then how like almost like belief in the diagnosis can bring forth the traits even more palpably. Like this is kind of what, psychosomatic illnesses are in a way, and psychogenic illness. So what do you think of that?
Oh, I think so. I think you're right. And I think this dissociative identity disorder, well, we would be dissociated from our identity. You know what I mean? I think people are very dissociated from their identity. So it makes sense that the identities that have, let's say, the tics, the nervous tics that I was kind of just showing you with the grabbing the phone.
Yeah.
That those tics kind of becoming more common, they make sense, just like the dissociation from yourself, because so many people have avatars, they have other identities online, they have very elaborate identities online, so I can see why you'd lose your sense of self. And I think then you live in a world where everything is pathologized. I can see how it combines into this kind of scenario where you're being diagnosed by your online life, or your online life is diagnosing you. I'm not sure where this is going to go, though. I'm not sure how this is going to, where are we going to go? Is there going to be a pushback? Will people just kind of push back from being online all the time, and will that be the kind of result? Or, because I was just having a conversation with somebody today in a cafe, and there was music coming from the guy across there because he was listening to something. So he was listening to some TV program or whatever the hell he was on. I'm like something in the 1950s, a TV program, but a clip. Then there was people to the right who was listening to music. And I was like, there's music on the cafe. There's your woman to the right. your man to the left, and we're trying to have a conversation, and it's awful. And she was saying, yeah, I'd say in the future we'll all be walking around with our kind of pods and nobody will hear anybody. And I was like, we're getting more and more fragmented and more kind of atomized into me and my online life. And that is all I am. You know what I mean? It's frightening. It's so lonely. It's so lonely for these people. I really do think it's so bad. God.
Are you saying though that like being immersed in this cacophony of sounds and discordant noises, like are you saying that people were better at tolerating that in the past? Or are you saying that that all these different, like everybody has some kind of electronic stimulation that's separate. We're all in the same room, but we're all doing our own individual things with our electronics. That's what you mean.
It used to be we were all listening to the one song that came on the radio because we were in a cafe together. We were having a communal experience.
Yes.
And sometimes what would often happen in a cafe is the staff would say something funny to the other person. And we'd all hear it and smile, and there'd be a communal moment. Or a nice song and you'd look up and you'd catch somebody's eye because a lovely song has come on, and you'd look back down into your experience. And that's all gone. Not only has that all gone, but it's gone into an irritating way of he's got annoying tinny music over there and it's his taste and it's not mine. And I can't hear it properly anyway. And she's having a conversation and it's atomized and it's really individualistic. So it's actually the antithesis of the communal cafe experience, which I used to love. And it's actually, it's we're fighting with each other for our sounds, if you follow me.
And that desire to be part of a larger cohesive unit keeps popping up in these micro communities online, in these diagnostic obsessed kind of online worlds. Like the need to be part of like, oh, did you see that? Oh, that was funny. Yeah. Like the need for that doesn't go away, but it keeps getting kind of channeled into different ways online. And into ways that are online and ways that are so specific and so particular. You know, it's like these affinity groups at schools. Like you are going to be amongst people for whom like the unifying strand is like your identity or your belief in this political view or your desire to do this or that thing. Whereas in other times, our sense of identity came from just like kind of our local environment, and your local environment by definition is mixed with all kinds of different people, and you're going to meet people you don't necessarily have the exact same kind of life as, but you all live on 43rd Street and you go to this cafe on Saturdays. Like that sense of community is being transferred into like, oh, what's your identity label? Oh, you too, me too. And we're going to find all the ways that we're so identical. Like it's a different way of feeling connected.
And a negative way, because look it up because it's a lovely song is joyful, or smiling because the manager saying something funny to the other staff manager. There's lots of different ways. While the way it has gone online has gone into we will meet over distress, we will connect over distress. That's how we're going to connect. And we're not going to connect over the more joyful. The only joy we're going to get is in the connection over distress. That's where we get our joy. It's fundamentally negative, and it's rampant. Like way back in the day when social media was first beginning. And do you remember those pro Anna sites and pro Mia sites and stuff like that?
Yeah.
That was the canary in the coal mine of where this is going to go. People finding each other, communities finding each other. And previous to that, like in the 1990s, an awful lot of, a completely different context, but an awful lot of child abusers found each other online. And I hadn't known that, but I kind of basically child abuse tourism grew from that because they started they started swapping information about go to this country, and you know what I mean? So that all sorts of things grew from those online connections. And right from the beginning, I would argue, a lot of them were negative. They weren't positive. They were, and why that is, I'm not quite sure, other than if you're going online way back then looking for a community, you probably didn't have one where you were, if you follow me. And of course, there's always, and I'm among them, unusual people who don't find a community very easily. But you still have to keep a connection with the ordinary cafe community. Do you know what I mean?
That's
because
right.
it
That's
brings
right.
a lightness to your life. Somebody smiling at you, you know, because your eyes meet because the kid is cute. Do you know what I mean? You need
Yes,
that.
totally.
And that's where the identities and the pathologies and the diagnoses, they're missing all of that. They're missing all of that colour and context of life.
Yeah. And I think, again, like in the right dose and in the right context, like if you have some sort of group you connect with because of this particular thing about you, but you also have a rich connection with other types of people and other types of contexts, I think that's probably fine. I think when something becomes the exclusive and only way that you find community, that's always a risk. And I think that's also a risk of radicalization, you know, like getting indoctrinated or going too far down a rabbit hole. That happens when you only have one singular avenue for connection. Like, it just dawned on me that that's kind of a characteristic of like extremist groups. Like you kind of start rejecting anybody who's not part of that. And I think that same thing can happen in a diagnostic label or any kind of special interest that an individual has. If it's the only way, you risk kind of getting blinded, I guess, to a degree.
That's such a good point. I remember, you know, when I was growing up and like there was an awful lot of Irish nationalism, an awful lot of fighting around politics. And there was a certain type of person who was very pro-Ireland. And they would come out with these slogans. They were so one-dimensional. And, you know, they'd have their songs or their slogans, and it was just, that was what they were. They had completely built their identity around that kind of personality. So, and I remember, it's a zealot. It's a zealot, but there's lots of ways to be a zealot. Right. And that's what it is now. I do want to go back to, before we finish on this, I do want to talk a little bit about, you know, these diagnoses, you know, the way they've slipped in lots of different ways. So it's not just ADHD or autism or anxiety, and depression, that have all slipped into a much wider. You would not have got those diagnoses 30 years ago. Now, some people would say they were too narrow and too many people were being missed 30 years ago. And now perhaps they're too wide. But arguably they're doing the same with, because I was studying it. I studied it for my new book, that, like, you know, things like osteoporosis among older women. That's a really common one. Or being pre-diabetic, when we're all pre-diabetic. Or the new one for myself,
Premenopausal.
No, perimenopausal. No, you only have to yawn, or you have to just say, "Oh, I'm feeling a bit perimenopausal." I'm not perimenopausal. I'm slightly hassled. Well, maybe I am perimenopausal. I don't know.
The entire 55 years before you are perimenopausal. Between puberty and menopause, that whole period of time.
I was bringing it up. I was bringing a big roll up to my perimenopausal, and you jumped in perimenopausal.
I'm sorry.
No. But that's how our age group.
It's because I have ADHD. I interrupted you. That's why.
No, but it's exactly reflective. It's so reflective of every time you turn around, somebody somewhere. If you said, "I'm a bit worried about my mother," you know, she's sick. I shouldn't laugh, but she's sick or something. They'll say, "Yeah, you might be perimenopausal." Sorry, what's that got to do?
It's like so random.
It's not exactly a conversation I had, but it's similar to a conversation I had recently. And I was like, no, this is just a worry that has substance that I'm worried about. And I'm not, like, maybe I am, I've no idea if I am or not. And it's not, and I'm sure, because I've met somebody and, you know, she was told she was perimenopausal, and it was an amazing framework for her to understand. But there's something about the chip of everybody else, like other people who are getting the false diagnosis. There's something about that is very detrimental to society on a bigger, you know, and the people who say, no, it's good, are missing, I would argue, the chip of all the false diagnosis that's been thrown around. I do think it's an issue. And I think if you look at the way, I think a reflection of how badly we're doing mental health, and I do think we're doing it really badly, even though we're trying. If there was a God, he'd give us top marks for trying. But our performance, our actual action isn't great. When we look at, and this is a very serious subject, but I think it's really important to bring it up, when we look at how we've handled suicide, you can see how badly we've done it. So, like, years ago, suicide was very taboo, and the numbers were low, but they were being miscounted because there was a lot of people dying and people weren't admitting it because it was taboo. So that was certainly happening. But nowadays, and it's come within me being a child and my children being a child, this has happened. Nowadays, it's become so much the opposite of taboo that children these days are throwing the word suicide around in a very cavalier fashion. And it is a really, really, really bad impact on everything. Because the kid is a kid who has a child's understanding of the word and of the impact. Everybody else is an adult, whether it's the teacher, the counsellor, or the parent. And they can't take it lightly. Even if it's being said lightly, they can't take it lightly. There's protocols around that word. And so all sorts of protocols get rolled in. I remember, one kid coming to me and she said, like, now that you have all drilled me about this word for 72 hours, I now realise I was using it lightly. However, like, honestly, we all are. We're all doing it. And ye guys are all taking it too seriously. And I'm like, well, then society's gone wrong. Because we're using, they have been taught, it's at the back of their toilet doors. It's when they're washing their hands. It's when they're walking down the school corridor. Do you follow me? Suicide, suicide, suicide. And it's gone into their language. It's gone into their language of distress. And they haven't learned that, no, that is a word you don't bring up lightly, and if you bring it up, it's you've thrown something onto the table like a concrete block that will now everybody has to look at. And I don't want people to be afraid of saying it. I don't want it to be taboo, but it's reflective of the really bad way we're managing mental health, that kids are throwing that word out so lightly, and parents are just about it. They're so upset about it.
Yeah. We did another episode on suicide, and I think most of that was about trying to clarify the misinformation around gender and suicide. But I think you're so right, because I hear this a lot where, like, a kid in the pangs of their distress will just say something about suicide, and then all of a sudden everybody goes into crisis action mode and they're like rushed off to the hospital, and the kid didn't really intend for it to be that big of a deal. Like, I think you're so right that there's something about this. I'd love to talk about this further. This is really important. Maybe we can do that on another episode, because this is like a real kind of phenomenon amongst young people. That
society has taught
suicide in a way that is that society's taught them.
And in fairness, because I find an awful lot of adults are saying they don't realise they're devastating me with this, and the parents are often looking quite angrily at the child for kind of throwing this out like confetti. And I'm like, in fairness, those kids are reflective of their environment. They're all doing it. Therefore, it's not just your kid. They're not being manipulative. They have learned this language. And they've learned this way of communicating.
Completely.
They have learned to understand their distress as suicidal. They've learned that framework. It's a framework they have learned. They've learned to understand their worries as anxiety.
Yes.
They've learned to understand their sadness as depression. And they've learned to understand their despair, which is part of the human condition. We can fall into despair because life can be very hard. And you can have 6 hours of despair, or you can have, an hour of utter despair. And then you can go, I need to have a wash. I need to have a shower. I need to get myself together. And that's not suicidal. It's despair, which is a terrible place to be. And also you can move beyond it. We haven't given them the correct language, I think. I think we've given them diagnosis language or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of how clinical labels, clinical language, when not used very, very carefully, can take on this other meaning in the life of a young person, the mind of a young person, that is not actually appropriate, and it's not the right framework to help them understand their distress.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, I do want to kind of put an idea out there to the listeners.
Oh, yeah.
So we have this Patreon listener community that we are really proud of, and we're also making a lot of updates and changes to. And right now we get a lot of great listener questions. If you join at the Q&A tier, you can submit questions and we answer them once a week. And a lot of our questions have to do with stuff that's going on with kids struggling with gender, and a lot of them are from parents. But we have a good number of mental health professionals who are also part of the listener community. And so if you are a school counselor, a therapist, a psychologist, or if you're like a school personnel, a dean of a school, a teacher, please consider joining our listener community and submitting some questions, because we know that there are a lot of different, people and types of professionals who are encountering these kinds of questions in their work, and we'd love to address some of those. So if you want to, please go to widerlenspod.com, that's our website, and go to our listener community page and consider joining so that we can engage with you there and also take some of your questions.
And can I add to that? I really feel with gender, it's gone through different phases. For me, 2 years ago was the phase of the parents and the parents' voice, and it got lifted. And then there was the voice of the detransitioners, and the detransitioners' voices got lifted. Now I feel education. I think education, this is the year for education. What's going on in the schools? How are we handling mental distress, gender distress, all sorts of things in the schools? It feels like this is the year for education. I think an awful lot of teachers are really, really in the trenches with this, and they're finding it difficult. Genspect released this amazing educational policy for the US. It's a sample policy that lots of different schools. Oh my God, it's a very serious document. It's very well referenced. It's very scholarly. And it's
we'll include it in the show notes.
Yeah, it's really, really good.
Yeah.
And I really think the teachers who have been till now rudderless and without a guide and without direction and frightened, I think now is the year. This is the year, and I'd love us to kind of grapple with this on this podcast, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, I think that's a good place for us to sign off, and we look forward to seeing you all next time, and we hope you will attend the Detrans Awareness Day conferences and events that are happening all across the interwebs.
Yeah, they'll be over the next
Stella,
few weeks. You'll
time.
see them everywhere. Okay, bye.
Yeah. All right, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. Listener support means a lot to us. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe on iTunes and leave a review.
For more information, visit widerlenspod.com. There you'll learn about joining our listener community, how to contribute to our show, and where to find us on social media.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.